Hey guys, welcome back to Based. In case you can't tell, which you probably can't if you're listening to this on audio only, I am super excited about today's episode. Sometimes I have episodes in my back pocket for a while that I'm kind of sitting on and just waiting for the right moment. And this was sort of one of those, and given some of the headlines over the past month, I think it's finally time to bring it up to bat. As you've probably heard, Elon Musk is trying to buy Twitter so that he can make it better and create a platform that actually upholds and protects free speech. And in reaction to this, the left has lost its ever-loving mind. I'm not joking. They are more upset about this news than they are Putin. It's very bizarre. One journalist named Max Boot even went so far as to say, "For democracy to survive, we need more content moderation, not less." Where's the clown face emoji? Anyways, Musk's offer has brought an ongoing feud in society back to the surface, and that feud revolves around the content moderation practices of social media companies. And this is one of those fights that honestly makes me so happy to be a libertarian because I have clear-cut defining principles that ensure I never become a big fat hypocrite like so many Republicans and Democrats have become on this issue. They are really out here looking messy in these streets. You may remember this fight really got up and going a few years ago when Twitter first started making some of then President Donald Trump's tweets marked as fake news, or they were saying that there was violence in them. And was that a crazy thing for Twitter to do? Yeah, they literally let ISIS and the Communist Party of China tweet. I think they had bigger fish to fry. But did Twitter have every right to make those decisions? Also, yes. This isn't even a nuanced debate. It's actually a black and white issue. Anybody who believes in free speech and free market capitalism has to align with this line of thinking, that they had the right to do it. There's literally no credible argument to be made to counter that. Just as Burger King can kick you out of their property for just about any reason that they want, so too can online companies remove you or things you have to say if they violate their terms. It's their property. And if you dislike that, you don't have to frequent their businesses. But I would argue that Trump actually really doesn't care about free speech or the free market, and so he didn't actually respect that. So what did he do in response? Actually, he did something that I would argue is pretty politically smart. Because while he does not like free speech or the free market, he knows that his supporters do, or at least they like to think that they do. And so he couldn't come out and actually start attacking the First Amendment, which is what I think he actually wanted to do back then. Instead, he pulls out this obscure component of the law that most people had never heard of before that moment, called Section 230, and he starts attacking it instead. And he convinces his followers that this tiny little law is the source of all of their censorship woes online, and he spreads a lot of fake news about the way this law works, and he starts to really rally his party against tech and social media companies and their ability to moderate content. Now, at the same time that this is going on, the left is also getting pretty riled up against social media platforms and content moderation too. Why? Well, because a not insignificant portion of the left still believes the lie that the 2016 election was stolen from Hillary Clinton by Russia, and that they predominantly use social media to do it. So the left believes social media companies should actually censor and moderate content more heavily to prevent things like the election of Donald Trump from ever transpiring. Now, I want to be really clear. This is an asinine conspiracy theory that has been spread by the majority of our media institutions and our intelligence agencies, and it has been thoroughly debunked. And if you need a refresher on that, you can go back to my old Based episode on elections where I went through all the nuts and bolts on that. But because our media is filled with hack jobs, the majority of the left space never got the memo that the story was made up out of thin air, and they still believe it. And because our Congress is also filled with hack jobs, a lot of Democratic politicians continue to use this narrative to rile up their base and work against tech and social media companies and their ability to moderate content. So now it's important that you understand both the left and right are attacking tech and social media companies at the moment, and they're both working to either reform or all out repeal Section 230 and the ability and or responsibility of social media companies to moderate their content. But they have very different yet equally awful motivations for why they want these things. The right at large want social media companies to censor content less. They believe they're being throttled online, that their views are suppressed, that they're more likely to be removed or flagged for their opinions, that social media companies wrongfully label their content as fake news while not applying an equal or fair standard to statements made on the left. They think that all that together prevents them from participating in the town square, and they would argue that it violates their right to free speech. They believe that content moderation decisions like Twitter's decision to block the very true Hunter Biden story during the 2020 election swayed the outcome, or that Facebook's decision to block COVID information that went against the CDC's narrative cost real lives. And are they right about all of this? To some degree, I would say yes, though I will argue in this episode that the scale that they believe it is at, I don't think is true. But while they may be correct in some of their grievances, I think it's important to point out continuously that they are wrong in their solutions, which come down to policy proposals that actually violate free speech and the free market. And on the other side of the aisle, you have the left, which wants social media companies to censor more. They argue that fake news online is so harmful and detrimental to society that companies should be forced to censor more or lose their liability protections. So you see that while the motivations may differ, the end goals are the same. Both Democrats and Republicans want to use the force of government to make companies operate the way they think they should operate. And if they don't, they each want to use the government to actively harm those private businesses and take away their rights. That, ladies and gentlemen, is the only violation of the First Amendment and actual free speech in sight here. So today, I'm going to set the record straight on what Section 230 entails, how it operates, how we should think about it in terms of free speech, and what the actual limited government free market solution is to the content moderation debate. So buckle up. The nice thing about understanding Section 230 is it isn't that hard. It was written in the 1990s, its authors are still alive, one of them is actually even still in the Senate, and it's actually a pretty short law, which is one reason that it drives me absolutely mad that so many people continue to misrepresent this law. Because it's not that hard to do your own research and look into it. And you should do that before you start running around quoting demagogue politicians and advocating for policies that you don't understand. And this is why ultimately we can't have nice things in our society, because people advocate for things that they don't understand the ripple effects of. And I think that's what's been happening around Section 230 at large. Section 230 is a mere 26 words long, and it has been called the 26 words that made the internet. And it reads, "No provider or user of an interactive computer service shall be treated as the publisher or speaker of any information provided by another information content provider." This is not radical. Essentially, it says, you are responsible for what you write and say, and you are not responsible for what other people write or say. It's the most common sense law ever made. It really shouldn't even be necessary because this is already a basic component of free speech. But as you well know, politicians and the Supreme Court often struggle to remember what the Constitution says, and so sometimes they need a little extra reminding. And that was the case with Section 230, which was created by Senators Ron Wyden and Chris Cox at the dawn of the internet to ensure that the First Amendment was applied to the internet. That's it. As the internet was getting off the ground, a lot of people in DC were working hard to ensure that the regulatory framework created for its operation was one that upheld our Constitution and free market principles. Can you even imagine Congress pretending to look out for those things these days? I can't. And it became pretty clear very early on that liability protections were needed to ensure that users would move online and begin interacting and expressing themselves, and also to attract companies to the online marketplace. And what caused that realization was 2 lawsuits against early internet service providers, CompuServe and Prodigy. CompuServe had stated it would not attempt to regulate what users posted on its services, while Prodigy had employed a team of moderators to validate content. And now both companies ultimately ended up facing legal challenges related to content posted by their users. In the CompuServe case, the company was found to not be at fault because of its stance to allow all content to go unmoderated. The court said it was a distributor and thus not liable for any libelous content posted by its users. However, in the Prodigy case, the court concluded that Prodigy had taken an editorial role with customer content since it moderated its content. And they said that made them a publisher and therefore legally responsible for libel comment committed by its customers. And these were quite obviously very bad legal decisions that threatened the future of the internet. And that went against what the courts had actually held on these matters for decades, long before the internet. According to Wikipedia, prior to the internet, case law was clear that a liability line was drawn between publishers of content and distributors of content. A publisher would be expected to have awareness of a material it was publishing and thus should be held liable for any illegal content it published, while a distributor would likely not be aware and thus would be immune. And this was established in the 1959 case, Smith versus California, where the Supreme Court ruled that putting liability on the provider, which in this case was a bookstore, would have a collateral effect of inhibiting the freedom of expression by making the individual the more reluctant to exercise it. Obviously. And so Chris Cox, who was in the Senate this time, saw these court cases go down, and he realized that the decisions being made in them were bad ones that threatened free speech and the existence of the internet altogether. He said, "It struck me that if that rule was going to take hold, then the internet would become the Wild West and nobody would have any incentive to keep the internet civil." And he was right. No one, consumers or businesses, would use the internet if they were going to be held liable for things other people wrote on it, or if they were forced to host content they disliked to basically earn their First Amendment back. Why would people do that? They wouldn't put themselves in that situation. So Ron Wyden and Chris Cox step in and they create Section 230, which again merely says you are responsible for what you say and you are not responsible for what other people say, period. And Trump created a lot of confusion in his attacks on Section 230 by trying to claim that it differentiates between platforms and publishers. He has tried to claim that a company becomes a publisher when it moderates content and that it must remain neutral, whatever the hell that means, if it wants to keep its liability protections. Read my lips. Fake news. I have a terrible Donald Trump impression, but that was it. Section 230 does no such thing. If you are Twitter and you write and publish a tweet, you are the publisher of that tweet and you could be held responsible and liable for it, same as anybody else. But if you are Twitter and somebody else writes something on your platform, you are not responsible for what they say simply because sometimes you choose to moderate content. Twitter is mostly a platform that hosts what other people write, and the company isn't liable for that. It really is as simple as that. It doesn't become a publisher when it moderates content, which is merely just the company exercising its own free speech rights. But because it seems like a whole lot of people are very unclear on the basics of what free speech actually is, let's have a quick crash course. The First Amendment says Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. You have a right to express yourself free from government persecution. That's pretty much it. Notice it says the free exercise thereof or abridging the freedom of speech. That means the government can't tell you what to say, and it also means it can't tell you what to not say. It cannot force you to paint pictures or bake cakes or put signs in your yard or wear political t-shirts or post a comment on your website. If it were to try to, that would be an actual violation of free speech. Now, notably, you don't have a right to say anything you want without repercussions. That's a false perception a lot of people have around free speech. You can still be held liable for things that you say. You may be fired by your private employer. You may lose friends. Words have consequences. They just can't land you in jail in the US. You also do not have a right to be listened to or heard. I'll repeat it. You merely have a right to say or not say what you want and not be persecuted by the government for it. The end. So this is why it's really substantial that you understand Section 230. Because when Democrats say, we're going to take away your Section 230 protections and make you liable for things other people say unless you moderate your content more, that's an actual violation of free speech. That's politicians telling private citizens and businesses that they cannot allow certain speech on their platforms or they will be penalized. It's a very clear violation of the First Amendment. And when Republicans say, we're going to take away your Section 230 protections and make you liable for things other people say unless you moderate your content less, that's also an actual violation of free speech. That's politicians telling private citizens and businesses that they must post certain speech on their platforms or they will be penalized. That's a very clear violation of the First Amendment. So you might be wondering, if the First Amendment already says people have a right to free speech, and if legal precedent has already held that businesses aren't liable for things other people say, why do we even need Section 230? And that's a great question with an even better answer, which is that our court system is garbage. So in the United States, when you choose to sue someone, you are not held responsible for their legal fees and damages when you lose. That's not how most countries operate. Usually, when you sue someone throughout the rest of the world, you make money if you win, but you lose big time if you lose, and that's because when you lose, you have to not only pay your attorney's fees, but also those of the person you wrongfully sued. But not in the US. Instead, if you sue someone here, you can win big, and if you lose, there's not as much of a downside because you're basically just out your attorney's fees unless your opponent can successfully ask for damages. And because attorneys can also make a lot of money off of successful lawsuits, lawyers will often take on a case for free in exchange for a portion of the fee if they win. So ultimately, this means it's a very easy system to sue people in the US, and plenty of incentives to give it a shot even if you don't have a strong case. According to the New York Times, the United States is the most litigious society in the world. We spend about 2.2% of our gross domestic product, which is roughly $310 billion a year, or about $1,000 for each person, on tort litigation, which is much higher than any other country. So here's the situation that we face. Small companies don't have big budgets, especially when they're first starting out, and most businesses in the US are small businesses. And if they get sued, it could wipe them out financially before they even get the chance to defend themselves and plead their case. So if we didn't have Section 230 that clearly states companies are not liable for what other people write on them, it is likely you would see a ton of frivolous lawsuits against online companies. People would just start throwing things at the court to see what would stick and see what kind of money they could get. And most likely, the courts would still find that the companies are not liable for what other people write, because that's common sense according to the First Amendment, but it would be a costly and long process that would backlog our court system, bankrupt small companies, and be a massive drag on our economy. As I think it should be abundantly clear by now, Section 230 is just a common sense law that ensures fairness and that the free market can operate as intended. Individuals should be held accountable when they break the law or violate the rights of others. But it would be morally wrong to hold society at large, or even parts of society like private businesses, responsible for the actions of autonomous individuals. In fact, this course of action would let the party actually responsible for committing the libelous speech off the hook while punishing a third party that did nothing wrong. Thankfully, we do have Section 230, which creates a just and sensible legal apparatus for the internet and conduct on it. Without this protection, it is highly unlikely that the internet would have ever taken off or grown to its current state, much less produce the social media websites and online news outlets and other user-reviewed services like Yelp that we all now enjoy. What would the internet look like if we were to repeal or reform Section 230? It isn't that hard to guess, actually. While opponents of Section 230 think that its removal would force companies to host their content and not censor information that they dislike, it actually would probably have the opposite effect. If companies were liable for content posted on their pages by third parties, they would instead have to censor vigorously. And we've already seen a preview of what this would look like. We had this bill that was passed a few years ago called the Allow States and Victims to Fight Online Sex Trafficking Act, FOSTRA for short. It was signed into law in April of 2018, and FOSTRA carved out an exemption to Section 230 that essentially said websites would be held liable or responsible for content promoting or facilitating sex trafficking or prostitution. And in response, internet companies reacted quickly, even those whose primary purpose had nothing to do with sex work. Craigslist removed its personal section altogether. Reddit and Google also took down parts of their websites. Notably, these actions were not taken because these sections of their websites were promoting prostitution or sex trafficking, but rather because policing them against the possibility that someone else might advertise illegal services was an impossible task. So they just got rid of it altogether. It is almost inevitable that further eroding Section 230 would have similar impacts throughout the internet. Consider, for example, a company like Twitter. It could potentially be sued for the millions of user posts on its platform, and so it would have to start censoring many more of them or run them through a pre-approval process, which would slow down the flow of information on these channels as the companies would be forced to sort through and approve all this content. And ultimately, these actions would result in all of us having less of a public square, fewer information streams, and a less rich internet experience. Especially concerning, I think, about this is the impact these actions would have on smaller companies and startups, many of whom cannot afford to lose liability protections. Ironically, those who seek to harm Facebook or Twitter by repealing Section 230 would actually end up entrenching their power even more by putting their competitors out of business. And this brings me to another point on this topic, which is why are companies like Facebook actually lobbying for Section 230 reform? I kind of just told you, but I'll go ahead and spell it out. Facebook can afford to fight lots of frivolous lawsuits. They have full teams of attorneys who can swat you down like a fly if you even attempt to go up against them, and who can outlast you. And should the court sometimes not rule in their favor, they could easily afford the fine. But Facebook knows that their small upstart technology companies that are their competitors have no such resources. Many aren't even profitable for years and years, much less able to withstand a multitude of frivolous lawsuits soaking up their time and attention and resources. Facebook also has teams of well-connected lobbyists and politicians that they donate handsomely to. So they know that should Section 230 be reformed, they would get to play a big role in shaping and crafting the new policy, and they could ensure the chips fall in their favor. In politics, we call this kind of phenomena regulatory capture, and it is prevalent throughout our system. Anytime you see a company or an industry insider actively lobbying for regulations on itself, I promise you, it is always because those regulations will hurt their competitors more and they know it. And this is why I just kind of go slack-jawed at conservatives who hate Facebook and Twitter and want to get rid of Section 230. They think it's going to hurt them somehow. Sweeties, you're actively working to entrench their power and create an environment where it will be impossible to get competitors to them and get other options. So probably sit out politics until you're a little bit better at it, okay? This is not the way to go. While reforming or repealing Section 230 would have drastic consequences and virtually no benefits, there are a ton of unprincipled lawmakers currently working overtime to do just that. In Congress, there are numerous bills floating around that would hurt or repeal Section 230. Some, like Amy Klobuchar's atrocious Earn It Act, tries to make Section 230 conditional by saying only companies that assist government law enforcement agencies in collecting data without a warrant get this protection. Yes, really. Others, like Josh Hawley's Ending Support for Internet Censorship Act, only give companies Section 230 protections if they submit to an external audit that proves by clear and convincing evidence that their algorithms and content rule practices are politically neutral. Like, this is some seriously communist stuff. I don't even know where to begin with it, honestly. I cannot believe people are openly introducing bills like this. In Florida, the Republican state legislature passed a new law that imposes fines on social media corporations for deplatforming political candidates. Can you think of a bigger free speech violation? You must promote this politician or we will fine you? That is corrupt. And what made it even more corrupt is that they seriously did this, they carved out an exemption for Disney. You know, the most powerful company in the state that happens to pad all the pockets of Florida politicians. Yeah. That law was immediately challenged in court and has not yet been allowed to go into effect, but it still stands that that's what they've been trying to do down there. In Texas, the Republican state legislature passed a bill that requires social media companies with more than 50 million monthly users to regularly produce reports of the content they remove, as well as the regulations they use to guide their content moderation. The bill also makes it illegal for platforms to remove users based on their political views, and it requires a complaint system to be in place. That, too, was zapped with a lawsuit before the governor's ink could even dry on it, because it is obviously unconstitutional. But again, this is the kind of road they're trying to go down. Other states, mostly those under Republican control, are considering similar bills to these in Texas and Florida. And while it is likely that these laws will continue to be struck down in the courts because they are indeed unconstitutional, it is your tax dollars that get wasted in the process trying to defend these laws. And the economic uncertainty that they create in the process does lead to a lag in competition and innovation in the tech sector. It's just really not smart public policy. If you want to use the government to harm businesses for not acting as you want them to, or not saying things you agree with, that's as big government as it gets. There's no difference in that stance and the activist who tried to sue the cake baker in Colorado because he wouldn't make an LGBTQ wedding cake. They're the same thing. Both are wrong. Consistency, please. There is nothing limited government or free market or constitutional about any of these actions, and anybody pushing for them should be called out as enemies of these principles. Plain and simple. These people do not get to claim to be capitalists or supporters of free speech. They're big government buffoons. End of story. By this point, I hope I have convinced you that government control of content moderation is a bad thing. I may have problems with choices made by Facebook or Twitter sometimes, but you know what would make my experience online even worse? The government being in control of it. No, thank you. I seriously hear some people say with an entirely straight face that because social media companies are so big and influential, it is the same as the government censoring you when they throttle your content. Are you high? Can Facebook or Twitter put you in jail? Seize your property? Restrict your ability to work? Shoot your dog? I don't think so. I'm sorry your post on chemtrails got deprioritized, Jan, but get a freaking grip. These are free services. No one is forcing you to use them, and if you don't like their policies and practices, leave. Go build something. Touch grass. Find a way to actually get something done politically, because I promise you your memes aren't doing as much as you like to think that they are. I've got no patience for people who run around calling everyone else snowflakes, melting down when things don't go their exact way in the market. Freedom doesn't mean you get everything you want. It means you get to live your life free from government persecution and pursue what will make you happy so long as it doesn't infringe on other people. That some folks want to take an axe to private businesses because they don't get their way is childish and hypocritical. You either believe in capitalism or you don't. Furthermore, the experiences on social media are nowhere near as bad as some conservatives like to claim. In fact, I'd go so far as to say conservatives are dominating the online sector. Data show that consistently, conservative pages beat out liberals in making it into the day's top 10 Facebook posts with links in the United States based on engagements, likes, the number of reactions, comments, and shares the posts receive. Fox News and Ben Shapiro are consistently some of the most visible content on Facebook. I will say that you do rarely hear of large names on the left getting deplatformed, no matter how nasty they behave or how wrong their opinions. But it also isn't like conservatives are being deplatformed en masse either. All in all, these occurrences are still few and far between, and in contrast, libertarians and conservatives like myself are actually able to reach huge audiences with our views thanks to these platforms. Similarly, the concerns the left has about content are also overblown. Is there fake news online? Of course. Humans are dumb. I'm just kidding. Seriously, people make mistakes. There's going to be errors. But the way to actually handle fake news is to drag it out into the spotlight for all to examine and debate it. That's the only way of ever truly determining the truth. And it's also the only way you actually defeat fake news. Trying to suppress it just makes it feel more credible and it spreads. Instead, let it be debated in the open air. And if you feel you can't debate someone when you see something you don't like, consider that maybe you've got a bias you need to have challenged. While it's true that we are all under no obligation to listen to one another's speech, we should want to foster a culture that truly values and uplifts open discourse. It's how we learn and how we grow. It's actually a beautiful thing to be exposed to people who think differently than you. And if it instead upsets you, you probably have some emotional maturing to do, so go work on that. Intellectual curiosity and intellectual humility are both virtues worth cultivating. They'll serve you well. And as for the principled free market and limited government approach to all of this, because there is one, of course, it's actually pretty simple. More capitalism, please. The way to get companies to do more of what the market wants is to have more companies. When people have options, they have the ability to give their business to companies that operate as they wish they did. And then other companies are incentivized to change their policies if they want to earn your dollar. The way to get companies to do more of what we want them to do is to simply have more companies, more options in the market. When people have more options, they have the ability to give their business to companies that operate as they wish they did, and then other companies are incentivized to change their policies if they also want to earn your dollar. Currently, we don't have enough competition in the social media world, though you should never fall for the lie that these companies are by any means monopolies, not even close. But to get there, we need to vote with our dollar, which means actually going to use smaller competitors when they hit the market and spending less time on platforms that we don't like the practices of. You have to practice what you preach. We also need to push for deregulation so it's cheaper for new companies to get up and running. We need to eliminate corrupt and crony practices like corporate welfare and subsidies that give some companies an unfair advantage over others. And we absolutely need to protect Section 230 so new competitors won't be bogged down by frivolous lawsuits. The beautiful thing about capitalist systems is the evolution that they inevitably bring. The companies on top today likely will not be the same on top in a decade without great innovation and customer service. Creative disruption works, and sometimes we also just need to learn to sit back and let the market deal with the problem in its time before overreacting and asking for government overreach. And lastly, we need to find other ways to make our voices heard. Go get involved in the actual public square, which is typically your state legislature, not Facebook. Build coalitions, write articles, give speeches, speak with your lawmakers about issues you care about. This is how you actually affect change in the political sector. Personally, I'm rooting for Elon Musk. I hope he does get to purchase Twitter and create an environment online that truly does uplift and respect open discourse and free speech. And if he gets to do that, I think other companies will be forced to adapt as well. But until then, if you like this episode, be sure to subscribe and hit the bell so you get notified when new episodes drop, and leave us a comment as well. And until next month, stay based.